I suppose if you're psychopathic, you'd look narcissistic in the sense that, you don't care about anyone but yourself. But there are some kids who are antisocial, maybe even, you can't say psychopathic, but callous and unemotional, even in middle childhood and early childhood. And that is stable. They also tend to be that way in adolescence, and they go on to be psychopathic adults. These are the kids, tearing wings off flies. And it's not that they like to hurt people. People often get that wrong about psychopathy and especially callous unemotional behavior. It looks like callous and it is unemotional in the sense that you're not trying to hurt the other person. It's just you want what you want, and if they're in your way, tough. You don't care if they get hurt or whatever. It's not because you're cruel particularly. It's callous, and it's unemotional. It just doesn't bother you to see someone else in pain as a result of what you did. So it's interesting that did seem to be the most heritable aspect of personality in childhood. And it was kind of exciting at the time because no one had really studied that as a separate trait. And I do think there's something to it. And this whole area of, broadly speaking, antisocial behavior, or more specifically, callous unemotional psychopathy, is a really interesting one.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Robert Plomin, a behavioral geneticist and a pioneer in twin studies, adoption studies, and DNA research with over 800 published papers. I was first introduced to Dr. Plomin's work during my interview with Dr. Peter Salerno, where we discussed the genetic origins of narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. Plomin has watched that episode and kindly agreed to weigh in on the genetic origins of personality disorders, psychopathy, and so much more. Now, here's my conversation with Dr. Robert Plomin. On this show, Dr. Peter Salerno and I have discussed the genetic component of narcissistic personality disorder. For people to understand that through the lens of your work, I'd like to establish a foundation of the first law of behavioral genetics and the phrase, parents matter, but they don't make a difference. So what is the first law of behavioral genetics?
The first law of behavioral genetics is everything in psychology that can be measured reliably is heritable, and not just a tiny bit. We're talking about something like half of the differences between people. I might have to explain that more, but it's important to recognize that a lot of findings in psychology are tiny findings. We call it effect size. It's not enough to say something's statistically significant, because that's just a function of how big your sample is. So you can have a tiny mean difference between, say, boys and girls or something, and it can be highly significant statistically, but it doesn't mean anything because there's hardly any difference. So you've always got to ask about effect size. And genetic effect sizes are off the scale. In psychology, it's rare to explain 5% of the differences between people. And here we're talking about 50%. There's nothing in psychology that even gets close to that. So it's important, to make this point, because people don't recognize it enough. We're not just talking about, there's a little bit of genetic difference. We're saying that genetics, and my book, Blueprint, is the main message is that the subtitle is how DNA makes us who we are. And I believe that, and we can talk about the research, 100 years of research that leads up to this, but I believe that inherited DNA differences, which is what we mean by genetics, is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals. So we'll get on to the other bit of it, which you mentioned. It's parents make it a matter, but they don't make a difference. The environment is the other half of the variance of the differences between people, but it's not the environment we thought it was from Freud onward. So that's where we get into this kind of difficult to understand, almost unbelievable finding that parents matter, but they don't make a difference. And so in my book, Blueprint, there are 7 pages with this in this section called Parents Matter, but They Don't Make a Difference. And that got more attention than the rest of the book put together. So the point of that is parents, of course, matter. I mean, kids our species evolved so that babies couldn't survive on their own. They need parents. But more than that, parents provide the atmosphere for the children. And as Judith Harris, who wrote a famous book in 1990 called The Nurture Assumption, she points out poignantly that parents hold their child's life in their hands in the sense that they can make their life miserable, but they don't make a difference in the sense that, well, I don't know how far to go back on this, but when I was in graduate school 50 years ago in psychology, if you looked at the textbook, they would say schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. And it was just accepted in environmentalism. That is, we are what we learn. The environment makes us into who we are. And the first, and from Freud onward, thought to be the most important environment is the family environment that your parents provide. It's a reasonable hypothesis, but it really is wrong. Freud thought that things like toilet training and early parental behavior was completely responsible for the way we turned out and for our schizophrenia. And when people say genetics is dangerous, try that. 1% of the population gets diagnosed as schizophrenic. And people probably know that it develops later in adolescence and usually, late teens before someone's diagnosed, sometimes into the 30s. But then you're told as a parent, the question you asked, what did I do? Why is my child schizophrenic? And you were told it's because what you did to the child in the first few years of life. You can't change it. And more importantly, it's totally wrong. There's no evidence that these things about severe leaning from breastfeeding and severe toilet training, there's no evidence that those things make a difference. Whereas the evidence for genetics is super strong, and it just has been building up over the decades from twin studies and adoption studies, and now from DNA studies. We can identify some of the DNA differences that are responsible for our genetic propensity towards schizophrenia. So there's much more to say about that second part of the question you asked. The first part was the first law of genetics, and that is everything is heritable, and not just a little, but a lot. But the other point, I don't know if I've explained it very well, that parents don't make a difference, in part because genetics makes a big difference, and parents don't have control over that. But the other part is parents don't have control over either. It's called non-shared environment. Whatever it is, it's making two kids growing up in the same family different from one another, not similar. So what makes kids similar growing up in a family is genetics, because they're 50% similar genetically. But the other 50% of the variance of the differences, say in personality, are not due to nurture in the sense of systematic effects of the family environment. Whatever they are, they're making two kids in the same family different. So that's why we say parents matter, obviously, but they don't make a difference because they don't control genetics, which accounts for about 50% of the outcome, and especially so for schizophrenia, which is one of the most heritable aspects of psychopathology. But then parents don't have control of the levers of the environment the way they think they do. That is, if their child becomes schizophrenic, the environment played a role, but it wasn't those systematic things that they did to the child. I've come to think, after 30 years of trying to find these environmental influences, it's basically chance in the sense of idiosyncratic luck. Stochastic is the best word. It means it's just not predictable. Even if you could somehow replay your life, you couldn't predict that outcome environmentally. You certainly could predict genetically. So there's an awful lot there, and people interested, though, I encourage them to read my book because I go into all of these issues in considerable detail.
Yes, I've got my copy right here. It's an excellent read.
Excellent.
So we talked about the example of schizophrenia and how that's been essentially debunked as a parenting thing. What do you make of the argument that narcissistic personality disorder is the product of something similar, parenting, perhaps pedestalizing a child, abusing a child?
Yeah. Well, two things to say about that. One is all aspects of personality are moderately heritable, maybe not 50%, but like 40%. But there's evidence not that narcissism, and especially callous, unemotional, psychopathic behavior, is maybe more heritable than other aspects of personality. So there's that. And so there's strong evidence for genetic influence. But on the environmental side, it's the same story I just described. Even though it's reasonable to think that narcissistic parents have narcissistic kids, or that parents who have severe and harsh discipline or something cause their kids to be narcissistic, affect other aspects of personality. But there really isn't evidence for that. You can find that parenting can correlate with the kids' outcomes, but that doesn't make it environmental. Once you realize how pervasive genetic influence is, it affects everything. The first law of behavioral genetics, everything is heritable, and that includes parenting behavior. Mm. So if you find that parents are, the dark triad of personality, that some people, narcissism is part of that. You can find that parents behave to their child in maybe a narcissistic way or some harsh discipline, and that what the parent does correlates with the kid's outcome. But that doesn't mean it causes it. We all know correlation does not imply causation, but when you see a correlation between what parents do, like severe toilet training, and how the kids turn out, like schizophrenia, it's hard to resist interpreting it causally. The parenting causes the kid's behavior. But genetics shows that correlation is mostly due to genetics. And that can happen in three ways. One is that, as I said, the parents' behavior, including parenting, shows genetic influence. So it could be that what you're seeing is not X causing Y or Y causing X, but a third factor, genetics, accounting for that correlation. But more and more, I think it's parents responding to genetic differences in their kids. Mm. And, I don't know if you have kids, but you really do get a sense of that when, you have kids. And there's this famous saying, parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. Because it's an example of where you go wrong with environmental explanations. After the fact, you can explain anything. And a great example that you can try out as a party trick is, if parents of a young child have a child who's shy. I mean, it doesn't work if they're average, but say the child's shy. You ask them, why is your daughter shy? And they'll invariably give you one of two answers. And that is, I took her out too much when she was young, or I didn't take her out enough when she was young. And that exposes what's wrong with the environmental explanations. After the fact, they can explain anything. But where this saying, parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child, where that comes in is when you have your second child, genetics predicts your children will be 50% similar genetically. It not just predicts, we know they are at even a DNA level. They share 50% of their genes and they don't share 50%. That's sort of what sex is about. It's recombining genes. So that means, though, that they're 50% different genetically. So if your first child, say, is shy, chances are your second one won't be so shy. And when parents have more than one child, they can't help but be struck by how different these children are from the get-go, And I don't know if your audience has heard of this wonderful Norwegian author, Karl Ove Knausgaard. He wrote something like a 7,000-page autobiography in 5 volumes. And it's just amazing. It's like psychological Proust, minute detail about his children's life and his life, and one striking passage, 45 pages on going to a birthday party for his four-year-old daughter, and just minute observations of the interactions. And he was trained as a sociologist, and so he had the view that everything's environmental until he had more than one child. And he just happened to have three children who are about as different as any three children. You name the dimensions: sports, personality, intellectual ability, everything. So he really did come to realize that he didn't make those differences. And the birthday party story is kind of interesting because it makes an important point that he knew this daughter was quite shy. And so once he realized that, and it's not a pathology, there's just genetic differences. Shyness is one of the most heritable aspects in infancy of personality. And so what do you do then? You don't put your kid in therapy. You just say shy people are only shy until they get to know people. So you wouldn't just drop your 4-year-old off at the party, say, have fun, I'll see you later. You have her go with a friend. You hang out for a while to make sure she's comfortable. Problem solved. So I think that's what I encourage parents to think about the genetic component here, because there are things you can do about it to make life nicer for your child. But the flip side, and probably the most important side, is this parents don't make a difference issue, is that if parents still think that children are a blob of clay they can mold to be what they want them to be, and you can't as a parent. You have very little effect. Now, you can make your children miserable. You can make a difference, but you don't make a difference. The difference is, so if you want your child to be a sports star and they just don't have the genetic goods, you can make them better at it with, Erickson's 10,000 hours or whatever, but at what cost? And the kids aren't stupid. They know they just don't have it. You quickly figure out, despite practicing as much as your friend, say at running 100 meters or whatever, that kid is just, yards ahead of you, and kids aren't dumb. They realize that. And so if parents weren't dumb and they realized that too, they would say, no, find out what your kid likes to do and help them do what they're good at and what they like to do. And I do think that the idea of appetites, interests, is at least as important as the hard wiring of aptitude, So if parents thought about themselves as resource managers, helping their kid to find out what they like to do, give them opportunities to find out, and then help them be what they want to be, everyone would be a whole lot happier than if parents try to impose their view of what their child should be. So it's, parents can make a difference, but, it's like if with your spouse, if you think, well, she's okay, and I can shape her up and she'll be okay. So you do things for her to push her to be what you want her to be. I mean, that would be a disaster, right? I mean, you wouldn't do that. But that's what parents do with their kids. They do things for them to make them be what they want them to be. And you don't do that. You do good things for your kids because you love them and you want them to be happy. It doesn't mean you don't control them. You say, if you're an aggressive jerk, people aren't going to like you, and that's not a cool thing to do. I mean, you don't say you can't guide them in life at all, but you're not going to make them different in their personality, psychopathology, no matter what you do. If your kid has a strong genetic component for schizophrenia, they have a much elevated risk of being schizophrenic. And that reminds me to say, it's not deterministic, as Peter Salerno said as well. It's probabilistic. We're not talking about one gene. Do you have the gene for shyness or not? We know now from DNA studies. We're talking about thousands of tiny DNA differences responsible for the heritability, the genetic influence on personality. And that's important because it shifts from a deterministic, hardwired thing, like there are thousands of single gene disorders, like Huntington's disease, for example. And if you have that gene, you'll die from Huntington's. It doesn't matter what your environment is or anything. And the problem is that's the way people learned about genetics. So you say genetics, and they think deterministic, hardwired, can't do anything about it. But actually, if there are many genes involved, it's probabilistic. We can say your risk for being schizophrenic is much elevated, if you have these genes for schizophrenia. But it doesn't mean you will become schizophrenic, because the heritability is not 100%. It's more like 60 or 70%. So there's an awful lot to unpack there, and I'm sorry I babbled on, but it's sort of, the phrase in media res, in the middle of everything.
Yes.
You sort of, there's so many things you got to bring together sort of to get to first base,
Yes. And you have so much experience, something like 800 papers published. I mean, it's a wealth of knowledge. And one thing that we were talking about is sort of this idea that parental behavior is correlated, perhaps, with a child's behavior. I wonder if there's a feedback loop, perhaps. So if there's parental negativity, which is a phrase used in your book, could it be, if the child has narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, something like that, that they are manipulative as children, and then the parent is trying to deal with a manipulative child, rather than the parent being in this parental negativity is making the child a psychopath?
Yeah, exactly right. That was the point I started making about X's and Y's. So usually we think of parenting correlates with kids' outcomes. Say, parenting harsh, negative discipline maybe correlates with kids' narcissistic personality later on. And I was saying that because of our environmentalistic bias, it's hard not to interpret that as saying, sure, the parents who are nasty like that have kids who are nasty. But as you're pointing out, it could be that parents are responding to genetic differences in their kids. And I have 6 grandchildren, and the more I'm involved with them, and at this point in my life, I'm able to see that to a large extent, I'm responding to them. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, I've mentioned this story before, but I have one of those 6 children who just loves books and loves to read, loves to have me read to her. And, that's what I thought grandparents were for and what grandchildren were for. But the other 5, it would almost be abusive if I said, look, I'm the grandfather, you're the grandchild, you sit here and I'm going to read to you and you're going to like it. No, they want to roughhouse, they want to go out and play, kick a ball around. And in a way, I think a lot of parenting is like that, that we're responding to our kids. And that's good. That's as it should be. We're kind of fostering them becoming who they are, rather than trying to make them be what we want them to be. And I think it's a much better recipe for happy parenting, realizing you don't have as much effect as you thought. And why not enjoy it? And do things for your kid because you love them, not do things that you think will make them be what you want them to be.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, you had mentioned also callous, unemotional traits and the heritability of those traits being perhaps even more than usual. Could you say a little more about that?
Well, yeah, if you search my former student, Essie Viding, Viding, did quite a few years ago when she was doing her PhD with me. But I have this large twin study of 10,000 pairs of twins in the UK. And as part of that, she was interested in psychopathy. And Hare's notion of callous, unemotional behavior as being kind of the key to this. And we were interested in this because my colleague at that time as well, Timmy Muffet, had this theory that's become quite famous about a developmental approach to this that is basically the antisocial behavior more generally, rather than specifically narcissism or psychopathology. But the idea is that that antisocial behavior is almost normative in adolescence. Some people have even made the case, if you're not a bit antisocial in adolescence, there's something wrong with you. But be that as it may, there are some kids, and that antisocial behavior doesn't predict adulthood. But there are some kids who are antisocial, maybe even, you can't say psychopathic, but callous and unemotional, even in middle childhood and early childhood. And that is stable. They also tend to be that way in adolescence, and they go on to be psychopathic adults. So these are the kids, tearing wings off flies. And it's not that they like to hurt people. People often get that wrong about psychopathy and especially callous, unemotional behavior. It looks like callous, and it is unemotional in the sense that you're not trying to hurt the other person. It's just you want what you want, and if they're in your way, tough. You don't care if they get hurt or whatever. It's not because you're cruel particularly. It's callous, and it's unemotional. It just doesn't bother you to see someone else in pain as a result of what you did. So it's interesting that did seem to be the most heritable aspect of personality in childhood. And it was kind of exciting at the time because no one had really studied that as a separate trait. And I do think there's something to it. And this whole area, broadly speaking, antisocial behavior, or more specifically, callous unemotional psychopathy, is a really interesting one. Mm-hmm. And I don't know quite where narcissism fits in that. Narcissists aren't all psychopaths, are they?
Comorbid, right? but not necessarily all the same. Although some theories do want to sort of just lump them together, I think, for the sake of people who are victims, targets, really, of just understanding roughly what you're dealing with.
Yeah. I suppose if you're psychopathic, you'd look narcissistic in the sense that, you don't care about anyone but yourself.
Yeah.
But I know there's more to narcissism than that.
Yeah. There's a really good work by a woman named Karen Mitchell out of Australia, where she used surveys with people who are professionals who had dealt with psychopaths or people with narcissistic personality disorder, all of them with an average of 20 years experience. Really, really great work, really deliberate. And what she found was that it made sense to model them as just a cluster dark personality, and then to have distinctions that pull out. So some might have a distinction for wanting more attention. And you might say, well, that person looks like narcissistic personality disorder. I think this also kind of touches on the way that you see defining psychopathology in the future as well, with more of these quantifiable spectrums rather than a you have it or you don't sort of situation.
Yeah, that is another important aspect in another chapter in my book. The chapter is called The Abnormal is Normal.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that is, I think it's really what's held back psychiatric research is following the medical model, where in the medical model, the first thing you want to do is diagnose something carefully. And the example often given is cholera. You want to know if these people really have cholera. So you carefully, you don't have to do it so carefully with cholera, but you got to say these people have it and these people don't. Cases and controls. And then you look for the factor responsible for that. Yeah. And so in the 1800s, it was found that it was contaminated drinking water. Problem solved, And that's the medical model then thinks of these dichotomies. Are you a case or are you control? And they're looking for a single factor that's responsible for it. Like COVID and the SARS virus, for example. That's another example. And again, you'd want to know, do these people really have COVID? So then you've got a test for COVID, and so you can really say, okay, these people have COVID, and what causes that? And you can show this virus is what causes it. So that's the medical model. But the problem when you turn to common disorders, and this is throughout medicine, it isn't just limited to psychiatry, but common disorders. I have a paper in 1996 called Common Disorders Are Quantitative Traits. And this ties into what I said earlier about single genes versus polygenic influence, where we have many genes involved. Because if there are many genes involved, you don't have a dichotomy. If there's one gene, you say either you've got that mutation or you don't. And there are thousands of traits like that, of disorders like that, but they're extremely rare because natural selection's good at getting rid of those if they are deleterious. But when there's many genes involved, it's a lot harder because those genes are spread out all through the population. And just statistically, you'll keep getting people who have a more of these tiny mutations that make a difference than other people. But the thing is, it's perfectly normally distributed. I'm drawing here the bell-shaped curve that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. And these when there's multiple genes involved, those genetic risks are completely normally distributed. Now, it's not to say there aren't problems. You can still say, let's draw a cutoff here and say people above that cutoff will say are at genetic risk. But the evidence is so strong now, you just simply can't say that someone either has even schizophrenia or not. Certainly alcoholism or depression. Any clinician who's worked with patients knows you don't wake up one day schizophrenic. You don't wake up one day as alcoholic. It takes it's a long process to get there. But then you also realize that these sharp lines we draw in our diagnostic manuals in psychiatry between cases and control, it's just a fiction. And it's a harmful fiction because it implies like the single gene disorder or the cholera example, it implies that these people have it and these people don't. But it isn't like that. It isn't qualitative. It's quantitative. We all have thousands of genetic risks factors for schizophrenia. It's just a question of how many we have. And so it's a bell-shaped distribution. The people at the high end are more likely to be at risk for schizophrenia. And if you go extreme enough, it's said that people in the top 1% have something like a 30-fold greater risk of being diagnosed as schizophrenic than the rest of the population. But that doesn't mean that it's determined they'll be schizophrenic, because the risk is only 1% in the population. So some of those people won't be schizophrenic. But the thing is, it's just so the idea of getting rid of the medical model and realizing, yes, there's problems. There are people who have severe thought disorders. But what do we gain by pretending that there's this ideologically distinct category of schizophrenia? I don't see anything that it helps us with, because it implies you want to cure schizophrenia. But if there is no single cause, there's no cure. You're not going to make people not schizophrenic. What you think about is you think about causes and cures as quantitative. You say, let's ameliorate the symptoms. Now, even with schizophrenics, you can help people function better with CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. So there are things you can do as long as you're not suffering from this delusion that it's an ideologically distinct disorder, and it's those schizophrenics versus us normal people. We're all have genetic risk for schizophrenia. It's just a question of more or less rather than either or. So that's why the book chapter is called "The Abnormal is Normal." Mm-hmm. Because it's merely the quantitative extreme of the same genetic and environmental factors responsible for the whole distribution. So I do want to emphasize, it's not to say there aren't problems. At the high end of these distributions, it is problematic, So it's not to dismiss the problems, but our whole approach to them, diagnostically and in terms of causes and cures, are really off base. And genetics, this is where genetics and the DNA revolution is going to have its biggest impact, because all of medicine now is moving away from curing diseases to preventing them. Mm-hmm. And that's especially true for common disorders. Like even with obesity or alcoholism or schizophrenia, once someone's pretty far gone, it's not easy to put their lives back together again. But prevention, as Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it's got to be the case. And the neat thing about the DNA revolution now is we can begin to predict from early in life the genetic risk, because if you can measure these genes as we can, we create these polygenic risk scores that tell you about your risk for various disorders. Like my highest risk is for obesity, for example. And the neat thing about DNA is people might not quite appreciate this, that you start life as a single cell with half the DNA from your mother, half from your father. But the DNA in that one cell with which you began life is the same DNA, the same inherited DNA in all the trillions of cells in your body. And so that means that if you can predict genetic risk, you can do a study of adults and say which are the genes that are affecting adult schizophrenia or alcoholism or obesity. Once you get that polygenic risk score, you add up all these little genetic factors, it will predict just as well at birth as it will in adulthood, because your DNA doesn't change.
Yeah.
The correlation between your polygenic score at birth or even at conception with your adult polygenic score is 1. It's a perfect correlation because the inherited DNA differences don't change, except for a few random mutations, but they don't really matter because they're random. So so DNA is the best early warning system we have, and in the move from curing diseases to preventing them, this is key because we know that the best interventions in general are early and they're intense. Little tricks don't work, little gimmicks. So you can't intervene intensively and early for everybody, but if you can identify people at risk, then you can begin to intervene to predict and prevent. So DNA is the best early warning system we have. So it really is a very exciting time, in this shift from curing disorders to preventing them from happening.
Yes. So to create sort of buy-in on this genetic DNA is the big factor thing with narcissistic personality disorder. Is there a way to rule out the parenting theory?
Well, just from the weight of studies like twin studies and adoption studies, and it rules out systematic effects of nurture in the sense that we used to think about the environment and the family environment. That is, these parents are authoritarian or they have harsh discipline. It's usually assumed that from these environmental theories that that's the way the parent is. And it's kind of assumed that if they had more than one child, they would be that same way to 2 children. Now, it is possible that parents treat 2 children differently, and they do, as you said, in part because they're responding to differences in the kids. Like when I study autism to some extent, and can you believe that not before the first twin studies in the 1980s or late 70s, it was thought that that's due to, they call them refrigerator moms, mothers who are kind of cold to their children and maybe rejecting. So you see that correlation between parenting and kids' behavior. But a moment's reflection should have told people, you try having a kid who's autistic, who won't look you in the eye, who doesn't want to be held. You try acting normally to that child, and you'd be pretty weird. You've probably people have experienced this where some kids are just more cuddly than other kids.
Yeah.
And, you try to cuddle a kid who isn't cuddly and it gets very quickly into something borderline abusive, They don't want to be cuddled and you're cuddling them.
Yeah.
So,
and what an awful message for parents, too.
It is, isn't it? I mean, when people talk about genetics and they worry about genetics being bad, I say try environmentalism and mother blaming, which is mostly what the environmentalism was about.
So what would we expect to see in siblings if narcissistic personality disorder were a product of parenting?
The twin design compares identical and non-identical twins. It's like a natural experiment. 1% of all births are twins, and 1/3 of those are identical twins who are genetically identical in the sense that you can sequence their DNA and they have the same inherited DNA differences. So that's one method. But the method that is more to the point of your question is the adoption method.
Okay.
So the adoption study is like a social experiment. If the twin method is like a quasi-biological experiment, these are identical and non-identical twins are born they're conceived at the same time. They grow up in the same womb. They grow up in the same family. The difference is identical twins are twice as similar genetically as non-identical twins. So if something's heritable, you'd have to predict that identical twins are more similar than non-identical twins. And you can use that to study the correlation between parenting and children's outcomes, but it's a little difficult to understand. The adoption method is much more straightforward because there you've got, think of kids relinquished for adoption, and they get adopted by adoptive families early in life, and so they share the family environment with those parents, the kids and parents, and then you've got the birth parents who don't see their child after the first week of life. This is in the old days. Nowadays, it's harder to have a clean separation like that. But when I did an adoption study that's been going on for 40 years in Colorado called the Colorado Adoption Project, and in the 70s, that was kind of the heyday of children relinquished for adoption. It was the end of the swinging 60s, and really there wasn't contraception there, and abortion was illegal. So there were a lot of kids being put up for adoption. And so you got children who share environment but not genes with their children. These are parents and children who share environment but not genes. Those are the adoptive families. Then you have the adopted children and their birth parents with whom they share genes but not family environment. And then also we had a comparison group of parents who share genes and environment, natural families. So to make it simpler, a good example is body mass index, weight. So we know parents and offspring and siblings correlate substantially for weight. And no problem, it's always been thought to be environmental, and it makes good sense. Parents provide the food for their children and model lifestyles, of exercise and all of that. So the environmental hypotheses are always reasonable. And with the example of shyness, that's its problem too. It can explain anything after the fact.
Yeah.
But is it environmental? So if it's due to nurture, the effects of growing up in a family with someone, say parents and offspring where they share genes and environment correlate 0.4. So what would you expect if it's all environmental? The correlation between adoptive parents' weight and their adopted children's weight should be 0.4 if it's all environmental. And in half a dozen twin adoption studies, it's 0. Adopted children's weight has no correlation with their adoptive parents. 0.
And this is with the parents, like you said, buying the food, preparing the food, putting the food in front of the kid, showing their own habits, their own lifestyle around food.
Yeah. So that is pretty strong evidence that nurture isn't important. But then that would imply, is it really all nature? And how could you test that? You look at the correlation between the weight of the birth parents and the weight of their adopted away children with whom they never shared environment. 0.4. They correlate just as much as parents who rear their own genetic children. So that's a powerful way of separating genetic and environmental influences. And that's been done to a less dramatic extent with things like parenting and children's outcomes. Because in the adoptive families, there's no all that parents share with their children is that family environment. But the complication comes in the point that you made earlier. Parents could be responding to genetic differences in their kids. Even if you adopt a child, you could be responding to genetic differences in that child, which you can test by correlating the birth parents with that, because an index of genetic influence. So there's a lot of research along these lines, increasingly using DNA. So, but you asked, how could you show that adoptive parents who have harsh discipline which correlates with the kid's antisocial behavior or narcissism, how do you know that that's not just due to an environmental effect? And the answer is the combination of twin, adoption, and DNA studies all points to that. So again, I think it's such an important message for parents. They have much less control over how their children turn out than they think. And that's for good as well as bad. I get these heartrending letters once a month from parents, saying they did everything, they did everything they could for their children, and the child turned out bad. I mean, a drug addict or, severe psychopathology, that sort of thing. And they beat themselves up because a lot of the parenting books still kind of say that, parents are responsible for the way their children turn out, and they're just not. I know it's hard to believe, and we got a century worth of parenting books to overcome here, but the scientific evidence is very strong. So I don't have any hesitancy in saying parents have very little control over how their children turn out. They have a lot of control over the relationship and how nice it is for them as a parent and for their children. But often this attempt to mold children is counterproductive to having a good relationship with the child.
Robert, we're using a lot of terms here, environment, nurture, parenting. What do people misunderstand about the distinction between environment and nurture?
Yeah. Well, as in Judith Harris's book, The Nurture Assumption, from almost 20-some years ago now, the main point is that environment is not nurture. We thought from Freud onwards that when you say environment, you say nurture, and that's where the slogan nature versus nurture came up. Like if it's not nature, which means genetic, then it must be nurture. Well, if it's not genetic, it's not genetic, and that means some people would say environmental, but it's not due to those systematic effects of family environment. And what's more, it should be pointed out by the phrase nature, we mean inherited DNA differences. It's a very narrow definition. And really what we mean by nurture or environment is what's not genetic. So that's an incredibly broad definition of environment. It's everything that isn't due to these inherited DNA differences. And so it means, it doesn't mean nurture. It doesn't necessarily mean family environment. I've come to think, as I said earlier, that what that non-genetic influence is essentially random in the sense of unpredictable, idiosyncratic, stochastic. You just can't predict. It's not systematic at all. And I think that's an important message, one that I'm kind of focusing on now in my research, the idea that there's just noise in the system. And you can't really control that, but you can learn to accept it, that there's a lot more chance to life than people seem to think. We tend to think it's all deterministic, even in science, but there's a revolution going on in science from quantum mechanics, the incredibly small world of quantum mechanics, to the unbelievably, unimaginably large world of cosmology, the role of chance. And there's a wonderful book by Sean Carroll called, what is it called? A Happy Accident or something? The way so much of our existence as a human species, our Earth, maybe our whole universe, is due to chance. And it's kind of useful to recognize that. It's sort of the Buddhist thing of impermanence, that your life can change in an instant. And it's sort of a good thing to know that, that you don't have that much control. You can do the Stoic thing of doing the best you can with what you've got. But you've also got to recognize shit happens. There's a lot of chance. But that Buddhist sense of impermanence can help you enjoy your life more. Not necessarily carpe diem as much as just realizing from moment to moment, that's your life. And, all these grand plans we have, you've got to realize they might not be actualized. And, so you've got to live in the moment and enjoy it and be grateful you're alive, but to realize it can all change in an instant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that there's an underlying message in your book of embracing the influence of things like genes in your life, and it's so powerful too. Not only is there the genetic influence, but now we're talking about environment and things, and it seems our environment is not passive either. That we actually can be picking our environment based on our genes and interacting with our environment and bringing our genes to that interaction as well.
Yeah, very good. I'm really glad you raised that point, Brad. It's another chapter in the book. It's called The Nature of Nurture. Mm-hmm. And what it is, exactly what you said, is that we, in psychology, in the early 1900s, there was a movement called behaviorism, it's sort of learning theory. And it was based mostly on animal work. And it was a reaction against the philosophical introspection that psychology was in the 18th century, navel gazing. And the behaviorists were scientists, and they said, no, we have to be objective about this. So we'll forget what's going inside the head. We're only going to look at behavior. So you take rats and you shock them and you show that they learn a certain way, for example. So the environment from that stimulus response model, stimulus, shock, response, learning, stimulus response model, which ignores the organism in between, it was conducive to behaviorism, that all that's important is how you actually behave. Forget all this stuff about cognition and thinking. It's all in the behavior. So that's behaviorism. But then that became environmentalism. That led directly to environmentalism, because to be a behaviorist, you look at the environment imposed from the outside, because you don't think anything important is going on inside. So we still, surprisingly, I think about the environment that way. The environment is what happens to you. But what genetic research has shown, and I did some of the first studies on this in the 1980s, is that the measures in psychology that we call environmental measures show substantial genetic influence. And you say, what? How could that be? Well, thousands, I think 5,000 studies have used life events measures. So these are measures of, like, one of the most stressful things on life events measures is like moving house or getting divorced, for example, or having financial difficulties. But you just think about it for a minute. Are these things that just happen to you? Like, I've been divorced 3 times. I know it isn't just what happens to poor, helpless me. It's a relationship, and relationships break down. So the point of the reason why you find genetic influence on these environmental measures is because none of our measures are measures of the environment out there that have nothing to do with us. They're measures of experience, and experience involves us. So financial disruptions, getting in conflicts with people. I mean, that's where genetics comes in, because it doesn't just happen to us. It's our genetic propensities are playing themselves out in using the environment. So it's such an important point you've raised, this nature of nurture idea, that there's genetic influences on our experience, because that's how genes work. They don't come, like, one of the most highly heritable cognitive tests is vocabulary. And people say, how can that be heritable? You're not born with words. Right. Because what language is the DNA code? No, it's a channel. It's a verbal channel. Some kids they pick up words naturally, and they have bigger vocabularies. And so they use their environment differently to foster their genetic propensities. So in genetics, we call this nature of nurture thing gene environment correlation. That is, we seek and modify and create environments correlated with our genetic propensities. And that's how genes work, sort of by using the environment to foster your genetic propensities. So, like, if you've ever seen a musically gifted kid, or I also, for a while, studied mathematically gifted kids. These kids, it's how they use the environment. The mathematically gifted kids, when they go to these schools for mathematics, mathematically gifted kids. They joke math. They talk math.
Yeah.
And they're just getting so much more out of their environment than we do. And teachers know that too. You can't teach 30 kids and think they're all learning the same way. You're providing hopefully a good learning environment for them, but some kids are going to use that environment and streak ahead of the others. And I think that the computer revolution is making that more and more apparent, because with computers, there's no stopping kids now. I mean, a kid who wants to learn math, there's all these programs, the Cohen programs or whatever, Khan programs for learning math. So it's such a good point that you put DNA on the table, it doesn't do anything. DNA has to be inherited in a system that's evolved to respond to its environment appropriately. And these genetic differences help people. They make a difference in the end to your personality, because they're channeling you to experience the environment differently. And so this is going to be a big area of research, I think, how genetics helps us, how we use the environment to foster our genetic propensity. But stepping back from it, I'll go back to the first point I made, is that we need to stop thinking about the environment as out there and that what happens to us, but rather it's our experience, which is how we use the environment. And part of how we use the environment is our genetics.
Yeah. Yeah. When you talked about the math schools and things like that, it made me think. I had an experience where I was sort of an outsider. I was in the Navy, and I needed to go through Navy flight school, although I wasn't actually going to be a full-time pilot. And so I was in this flight school environment with all of these people who lived and breathed flying, and it had been their dream for a long time to fly. They had private pilot's licenses, and like you said, they could joke flying, they could talk flying. They had T-shirts with inside jokes about flight slogans and things like that, and keychains. Yeah. And I realized, there is something different about this group of people and this thing that they've been wanting their whole lives from me, and it was really eye-opening.
Yeah, I think that's another example of the appetites as well as aptitudes. They probably all had a certain, I mean, if they didn't have the aptitude, like the spatial ability and the basic sort of coordination. I'm a pilot too, and one of the things they teach you is it's more in the seat of your pants than it is in your head. Yeah. What I loved about learning to fly is it involves your whole being.
Yes.
It isn't just up here. You've got to feel it in, and like if you're flying in instruments or something, everyone's had the experience where suddenly I learned to fly in the Colorado mountains, and
Beautiful.
Which is a really tricky place because it's above, those passes are above the service ceiling of these single engine airplanes, for example. So everyone flying at night has had this experience where suddenly you think you're flying upside down. And you can trick yourself very quickly on this, and so you have to learn to trust those instruments. For example, so it's an amazing experience. But I think those guys must have not only had the cognitive and neural aptitudes that you need, but people who become obsessed with stuff like that, it must be the interest as well. And to some extent, it's a virtuous cycle, don't you think? That you do what you're good at, and you like to do what you're good at, and you do it more and more, and that's sort of the genetics fostering your use of the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it seems to amplify over the course of a lifetime, and then because we share genes with our parents, we seem to feel more and more like our parents as we get older. It's an amazing cycle, like you said.
There's a great anecdote about that. B.F. Skinner, was a famous Harvard behaviorist. He was really one of the big learning theorists, and he studied rats and pigeons. And his daughter, he raised her in a so-called Skinner cage, where he completely controlled the environment, thinking that he could make a perfect baby, and instead the kid was kind of screwed up. But this guy's an arch environmentalist. But later in life, he wrote a book on aging, where he had this famous phrase, "The older I get, the more I become who I am," which is sort of the point you were just making. And that's something that bothers people, that you start, as you get older, you start to realize, God, that's like my father. You become more of who you are genetically, and in part because as you get older, you don't give a shit, of what other people think. You're not censoring yourself so much anymore. You say, I don't like cocktail parties because I'm kind of shy, and that's okay. It doesn't mean I'm pathological. Although a lot of Americans, I think, seem to think that, shyness is sort of pathological, but it's not. People just differ, and they differ genetically. So accepting who you are, I was emphasizing parents and recognizing and respecting genetic differences in their children. But that also applies to ourselves too. I mean, I think, it helps to understand the strong genetic influence here. Not to say you can't do anything about it. Like I mentioned that my highest genetic risk factor is for obesity. And for decades, I tried all the diets, nothing seems to work. And people say, well, if you knew you were at high genetic risk for obesity, you just say, oh, well, eat, drink, and be merry. But to the contrary, I find when you know your genetic risk for alcoholism or obesity or even schizophrenia, it's actually very motivating, because I know that it's not just I gained a few pounds at Christmas. It's invidious in the sense that you add these pounds, you never get rid of them. And so by realizing that's strongly genetic, it doesn't mean I can't do anything about it. It means to do something about it, I've got to radically change my environment. So I just don't have junk food around, because I know a lot of it has to do with that. And then I was one of the early adopters of Ozempic, and it made a huge difference. I've been trying to get the company interested in realizing that my bet is that people like me with a high genetic risk are the ones who would profit most from these semaglutide drugs, like Ozempic.
Yeah.
But then I realized they're not interested in that because everybody wants to be thinner.
Maybe. Yeah. I wonder, would they see value, though, for being more accurate in their marketing or something like that?
Yeah, that was my line, really targeting people who need it most,
Mm-hmm.
but they're, the bottom line of the dollar, their best bet is just to market it to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a friend who's pretty high up in General Mills, and he says that they are pumping a lot of energy into this market of people who are interested in Ozempic and trying to figure out what's going to make it sell.
There's a dozen other drugs now coming on,
Yeah.
So,
yeah. What do you see for any sort of genetic role in there then, if maybe they're not bought in right now?
You mean in terms of weight?
Yeah. Weight as it worked with drugs or with some sort of intervention.
Well, first of all, I'd like to make sure people understand that individual differences in body weight are highly heritable.
Yes.
I've done surveys and you ask people about height, most everybody recognizes that height has a strong genetic component. But when you ask about weight, a lot of people still think, well, no, it's just willpower.
Right.
Skinny people can't understand how people like me have a great deal of difficulty staying short of obesity, and so the studies, twin studies, adoption studies, they're all converge. These are like dozens of studies, all converge on the conclusion that about 60% of the differences between people in weight are due to inherited DNA differences. Now, for height, it's more like 90%. But for most psychology traits, we're talking 50%. So 60% is still a huge heritable component, and that's important because then people need to, I don't know if it's true in the States, but there's a lot of fat shaming that goes on. And they're even talking about the National Health Service, penalizing people who are overweight. It's a huge health risk, and anything we can do would help. But I think Ozempic and those sorts of drugs are going to make a huge difference because of the links to diabetes, heart disease, cancer as well. I mean, it's just not good being overweight. And I've lost 30 pounds, and man, it's changed my life, because it's like carrying a 30-pound backpack. Your joints start to go, and you just feel so much healthier.
Yeah.
So it's been dramatic. And another thing that's interesting is there's studies now. What happens if you stop taking them, and within a year you go back to 85% of your body weight, your previous body weight, which suggests to me again that there's some biological threshold here for us.
Yeah.
Like I have a higher set point for this.
Yeah.
And so I just think it is fascinating, and I think maybe as more of these drugs are developed, we will begin to personalize them to a greater extent. Like for people with this genetic profile, they might respond better to this drug than another one. And this is happening with depression now, especially, like a lot of people are administered drugs for depression, but then CBT, it's cognitive behavior therapy, it's kind of questionable as to which one has a longer term effect, but in all the big studies now, they collect DNA, because what you want to know is maybe people with a strong genetic component, maybe they respond better to drugs or to one type of drug rather than another. Because the bad thing about depression is it's just trial and error. You try one drug, if that doesn't work, and we're not talking about a day or two, we're talking about weeks or months, then you try another drug. Well, someone with severe depression might commit suicide in between. So it'd be awfully good to know that people with this genetic profile will respond better to that drug. So this is the other main thing of where medicine is going. Personalization, instead of one size fits all, you use genetics to help you say, no, this drug is particularly good for this type of person. So the shift to prevention and personalized medicine is really going to change the shape of medicine in the future. And that includes psychiatry and psychological problems as well.
Yeah. Robert, it's so apparent that you are thrilled about the future of your field. We talked about the DNA revolution a little bit. As far as research goes, you're known for twin studies, adoption studies. What do you see ahead for research as there's more use of DNA information for research?
Yeah. Well, it's the DNA revolution that's going to change everything, because you're now talking about predicting genetic risk for an individual. So there's all sorts of implications for that in terms of predicting and preventing disorders, which you can't do unless you can predict. And we don't have many good predictors, say in psychology especially, but DNA predicts just as well from early in life as it does later in life. So that's going to be a huge area of research. But the DNA revolution has also given us more powerful genetic analytic tools. And I probably won't go into the details of this, although it's described in my book, that it's radically changed how we think about, say, psychiatric disorders.
Yeah.
It was thought we have, there are these manuals, statistical manuals in the American Psychiatric Association called DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. In Europe, it's ICD, but they're all oriented towards this medical model of trying to diagnose whether you have schizophrenia or bipolar manic depression, the big two psychotic disorders. And that's the first level of diagnosis, with someone who has severe thought disorders, is really very disturbed. Are they more manic depressive, which is called bipolar, because it's the ups and downs of cycles of depression, to mania. Mania, people makes them feel crazier. It's this wild, you do crazy stuff, you hallucinate. But so that's bipolar, and schizophrenia is basically a thought disorder. So that was the first distinction that you make. So genetic studies now say, we found genes for bipolar, we find genes for schizophrenia. It turns out they're the same genes. Mm-hmm. And you can then ask about the genetic correlation between these traits. So these are supposedly etiologically distinct disorders. Up until the last DSM, you couldn't be both. You couldn't be bipolar and schizophrenic because they're the first level in which you differentiate diagnoses. But now we know the genetic correlation is 0.6 between them. That is, if you find a gene for schizophrenia, there's a 60% chance that that gene also affects bipolar, makes you more at risk for bipolar. So it really has made a shambles of our diagnostic classifications in two ways. The first way we talked about before, they're not disorders in the first place, they're dimensions. And so all the stuff about, do you need 2 of these symptoms for 2 weeks and 3, it's like this checklist of symptoms that you have to have. But here with genetics, we're talking about etiology now. These are genetic causes that we're talking about. So dimensions, not disorders, and then a lot of the genetic influence is general across all disorders. That is, you inherit a genetic propensity to maybe succumb to the stresses of life and have adjustment problems, but it's not specific to schizophrenia or alcoholism or any of these disorders. It's kind of, we call it P, little p, which is general psychopathology. So most of the genetic influence is very general. What specifies whether you become schizophrenic or not is it's not genetic. It's maybe these chance sorts of influences. So that's such a dramatic shift because it, pulls down the foundations of psychiatric nosology. And again, it isn't to say there aren't problems, but it's again, what are we gaining by pretending we've got these etiologically distinct disorders? And, are you schizophrenic or are you normal or are you bipolar or not? So it really is like a revolution, you know?
Yeah. And Robert, your book came out about 6 years ago. How fine-tuned are we at this point with genetic testing, things like polygenic scores? How much value is there to be gained by getting this information for the individual?
Yeah. Well, my book came out just as this was happening, the revolution was happening, and it captured most of the first major wave. And what we've learned from the DNA studies is that the effect of any one DNA difference is so small that you need huge samples to detect it. So the first studies were done, say, like with 2,000 schizophrenics, which seemed like a huge number at the time. But now, to pick up these tiny, tiny effects to gain in prediction, we need to have larger and larger studies. So we're now talking about studies of millions of people. And so, the curve is starting to taper, it's reaching asymptote. So you go from 1 million to 3 million people, and you don't triple your gain, you maybe gain another few percentage in prediction. And so we're saying with schizophrenia, maybe we can predict 7-8% of the liability to schizophrenia, which is a long way from 100%, but it isn't 100% heritable, but that's still a long way from 50-60%, which is the heritability of a trait. And so the big problem now is this missing heritability. That is it just that the DNA effects are so small, it's hard to get samples large enough to scoop up these tiny differences? Or is it something we haven't thought about much? Like, we're only studying common DNA variants, and most DNA variants are not common. So the big thing now is whole genome sequencing. So up till now, we had what was called DNA chips, where you measure DNA variants that are common in the population because they give you more information. And we measure hundreds of thousands of them. So if you send your spit to one of these DNA testing companies, they'll put it on this chip that measures these hundreds of thousands of DNA differences, but they're the common differences. So they tag the genome of 23 pairs of chromosomes, 3 billion base pairs of DNA, but you've only got 600,000 points. What whole genome sequencing does is say, forget all that, let's just let's just sequence all 3 billion base pairs, which is what people are doing now. But you can imagine this is you got 3 billion bits of DNA you're dealing with. So, and you have to deal with that. You have to do that for millions of people to make comparisons. But that's all she wrote. That's all we inherit are those 3 billion base pairs of DNA. So to the extent it's heritable, it's got to be there. And I think there's been a hubris, thinking, well, we know how DNA works. But I think looking back on it 5-10 years from now, we'll realize we didn't know. There's so much we didn't know about the complexity of how DNA works. And so that's the real prize, is to think about how we can find the DNA differences responsible for heritability so we increase our predictive power. However, right now, you can make much better predictions from DNA for any of these things, like alcoholism. I mean, height, you can predict 40% of the differences. It's about 80-90% heritable. But, you're predicting a huge amount of the variance in height from birth or conception with one number, this DNA polygenic score for an individual.
And Robert, you said much better. Is that much better than the past, or much better than another method?
Than anything else we've got.
Oh, okay.
Everything else put together.
Thank you.
So, and that's true. Even predicting 7% of the liability of schizophrenia, put everything else we know, and you don't get anywhere near 7%. It's just that we're not used to thinking about effect sizes. So people say, well, we can significantly predict this or that. You can predict schizophrenia maybe from socioeconomic status or something. But people don't say, yeah, but how big of an effect is that? And the answer is we can make better predictions from DNA than we can from most anything. And that's especially true in my specialty, which is cognitive development and educational achievement. We can predict 16% of, in the UK, we have these national exams that kids are given when they leave high school at the age of 16. And so we got a huge amount of data on that. But from DNA alone, we can predict 16% of the differences between kids. Whereas everything else you put, we have the ratings of school quality. They explain 4% of the variance. We're explaining 16%, 4 times more better prediction from DNA than from the quality of the school you went to. Even though parents, especially in the UK where there's a lot of private schools, spend hundreds of thousands of pounds sending their kids to a private school. But the way I see it, there's no added value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Robert, we're talking a lot about prediction. One thing that I heard you talk about with Chris Williamson a few years ago is that dating is sort of a prediction system. I wonder what, as far as DNA, the latest DNA research, can we learn that might help us to make better choices in terms of dating, marriage, that kind of thing?
Well, there's one really strong answer to this, and that is, that goes back to single genes, though. And George Church, who's a famous biologist, geneticist at Harvard, MIT, offered to do whole genome sequencing of couples who are thinking of having kids. And the reason he was doing that is that I mentioned there's 7,000 single gene disorders. Most of those are recessive. If you go back to your Mendel, some genes like the genes that Mendel studied in pea plants were dominant or recessive. So a mutation that's dominant means if you get one copy of that mutation, you will show the disorder. But most genetic disorders are recessive in the sense that you need a copy of the mutation from your mother and your father. Now, your mother and your father, if they only have one copy, they're called carriers. They don't show the disorder. So with Mendel, with the wrinkled seeds of the pea plant, that's a mutation. Most pea plants have smooth, round seeds. But if you got that mutation, one copy of that mutation, you will have wrinkled seeds. It's hardwired, it's deterministic. But the thing about the recessive disorders is you don't see it in the carriers. And so most parents don't find out they're carriers for a single gene recessive disorder until they have a child who has the disorder and inherited 2 copies. Because what Mendel shows us is that you can just figure it out yourself. Their parents have 1 copy each. There's actually a 25% chance that their offspring will get 2 copies, 1 copy from each parent, in which case they have the disorder. So the vast majority of these 7,000 single gene disorders are recessive because if they're dominant, natural selection will quickly get rid of them because they show up. And if they're deleterious, they'll be gone, with the exception, I mentioned Huntington's, which is what killed Woody Guthrie. And people have seen the amazing, my favorite film in the last decade is the Dylan film, that just won Timothy Chalamet's.
Oh, A Complete Unknown.
Award. Complete Unknown, yes. Yeah. And he visited Woody Guthrie in that film, and that's Huntington's disease. Yeah. And so that's a single gene dominant mutation. The only reason that exists is because it doesn't show up until after your reproductive years. So natural selection can't get rid of it because you don't know you've got it. Mm-hmm. Now you can test for it, though, and determine that you do. So what this long story is about, the reason George Church was offering to do whole genome sequencing of couples is we can tell you that you're both carriers for this single gene disorder, which means your offspring will have a 25% chance of having the disease. So in 1 generation of screening, you could get rid of most of these recessive disorders, which supposedly cost, how these estimates are, but $1 trillion a year. I mean, it's most of our genetic diseases are like that. So that's going to be an important reason for couples to look at their genetic code. The chances of you both being a carrier, we all carry, say, 5, 10 of these very bad genetic mutations, but they're recessive, so they don't show up. And they're rare, but you do have some chance then of matching your spouse for that recessive mutation. So then you could decide what to do. You could decide not to have children. You could decide to do in vitro fertilization, where there are companies now that could say, you've got 8 embryos, and you can only put 1 in. You can only implant 1. So you can screen the embryos to say, okay, this quarter, 2 of those 8 have the disorder. You don't want to implant those. That's why you're doing the in vitro fertilization. So there's that, and so I think that's a huge reason to think about people doing whole genome sequencing. And there are companies now that are popping up that are focusing on this. But what your question is more about dating, I think, and
I have a question that's maybe a bit of a pipe dream. But is there a way to know that you won't marry a psychopath or a narcissist?
Well, eventually, if you can find the genetic prediction now, these polygenic scores, which I said are very strong for like educational achievement or intelligence, they're not nearly as strong for personality traits. And usually they're only explaining 2 or 3%. But that's not nothing. Mm-hmm. And, but it wouldn't be, say, if you had a very high polygenic score for psychopathy, but it isn't predicting very much, it isn't that informative yet.
I see.
So, but that's the goal, and that's that missing heritability thing. Mm-hmm. We know it's maybe 40% heritable. If we could find the genes and predict 20, 30% of the variants, that would be super predictive. I mean, it doesn't, it's a long way from 100%, but we rarely have, we never have things that are that powerful in terms of prediction. Mm-hmm. So that is the goal, but right now it isn't particularly productive. And a decade ago, there were a number of these companies popping up purporting to talk about the genetic match between you and your spouse for personality and that sort of thing. But they've been shut down pretty much because by the FDA it's sort of false advertising. They were promising much more than they could produce, really.
Well, Robert Plomin, before I get to my last topic, where should people look for you online?
I'm easy to find. I don't hide. It's just look up Robert Plomin, and you'll find everything about me. I'm at King's College London, and so I'm easily found, and my papers are all available online. So and if people want to contact me, my email's there as well.
Great. All right. We'll let everybody know in the description if they want to check it out. And Robert, I wonder, what have you found value in about knowing your own genes when you can't change them?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about weight.
Yeah, I do think we all seem to be very concerned about understanding ourselves, and it strikes me as odd that people don't realize a large part of that is kind of getting a sense of who you are genetically, your genetic propensities, and I find that very liberating. And cutting yourself some slack, it doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. Like me and my weight, I find it helpful to realize I have a strong genetic propensity to put on weight. And I know what that's about. There's two psychological mechanisms: satiety, feeling full, and sensitivity to food cues. And I'm doomed for both of those. I just don't, without Ozempic, I don't feel full, So I'm going out and there's food on the table in the restaurant, and I say, oh no, I'm full, I don't want any more. But before you know it, I've eaten it all. And like food cues, I can't make bread anymore because even the thought of warm bread you just made with butter melting on it, it makes me drool now. So I know it's a battle of the bulge, and I just know I have a fight there, and I know it's important that I win that fight, because weight is really a very important risk factor for so many disorders. And as I say, having lost all this weight, I feel tremendously better. So I think it is an important part of understanding who we are. And then as you become parents, it's super important to recognize and respect those genetic differences between your children, as I talked about at length.
Yeah. And Robert, one last question about you specifically. It seems you've said that you're never going to retire. What is it about your work that keeps you coming back? What are you excited about going forward?
Yeah, I keep saying I want to go out feet first, because I never thought that the DNA revolution would come along. I mean, I was at retirement age before it came along.
Yeah.
And how can you stop now when there's, so it is, we use the revolution too much probably, but man, this has really changed science, all of science. So it's just much too exciting a time, and I keep getting these great graduate students. And so as long as it's fun and I feel like I'm contributing, why quit? And in truth, part of the problem is I don't know what else I do because I love it so much, Yeah.
Well, Robert Plomin, thank you for the huge contribution that you do make, for your book that makes it accessible for other people to understand your work, and for taking this interview with me. I appreciate this so much. Thank you.
I enjoyed it a lot, Brad. Thank you very much.
To help raise awareness about narcissistic abuse, please share this video. It helps a lot.